Okay. Well, we'll get things going. So,
all right.
Again, welcome.
Well, I'll keep this kind of informal. But no, thanks for coming out, by the way. So I'm here to talk about my book, 100 Things Sounders Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. I actually think it's a pretty good book, not just because I wrote it, but it's a formula that they've used in the past around the country in other sports. They do these for basically all the major teams in major cities, but this was the very first time they attempted one of these books with Major League Soccer. And I thought that was good because it wasn't just a local company. This is a company in Chicago, so it would have big distribution with all the major chains like Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and that's kind of cool to walk around certain stores and just see your book in it. But nobody had written a book, and I started covering the team last year. The history is that I do sports enterprise and investigative reporting at the Times, but we laid off our soccer writer. Unfortunately, it's like a first in, last out situation. He was a very good soccer writer, Matt Pence. He actually works for the Athletic now. But they laid him off because of cuts, and they laid him off 2 weeks before the Sounders opened training camp to defend their title that they had just won. We said we can't have nobody covering the team, so they said, Jeff, can you go cover it? Because honestly, none of us knew that much about soccer other than Matt. And we were all drawing straws in the newsroom to see who was going to cover the team.
Literally or figuratively?
A little both. And thing is, I actually like covering them. I covered Major League Baseball for 16 years, and it's just a very different experience covering these guys. They're a lot more approachable. The organization is very anxious to get coverage. And I thought, I got approached, interestingly enough, like 3 months into my gig doing this. I was still trying to figure out the team's history, and I knew soccer, but I was trying to figure out, just get a lot more immersed in it quickly, on top of the other things I had to do for the paper, which is write a column and cover the arena and NHL situation. Covering these guys. So they approached me and they said, Jeff, can you turn this book around in 4 months? And I'd never written a book before, but I've always wanted to. And I thought, you know what? Hi, come on in. You didn't miss anything. You didn't miss anything. So they said, come on in, and no, I just said, come on in. They said, see if you can write this in 4 months. And I said, yeah, I can, but you got to pay me a little more. And it's like, okay. The thing is, I knew I'd be able to get this done because I'm around the team all the time. I travel with them on the road, not all the time, but on bigger games and stuff like that. So that would actually cut significantly down on the cost of doing a book. You see, I knew I wasn't going to have to spend a whole lot of my money that would need to be reimbursed later on. So that made it easier to negotiate with these people. And the thing with book writing is they'll always tell you to get your money up front nowadays. It's not like the golden days of Hemingway and stuff. Like it never has been a big money maker unless you're like a top New York Times bestseller. So I knew this from friends and experience. This is get your money up front. Your royalties, residuals, that it's so weighted against you anyway. Like you have to sell like 1 million books to actually see a dime later on. So that made it easier. I said, you want me to do it fast? I'll do it fast and I'll do it well, but you got it. And so that's how we went through it. And then it was a lot harder than I thought. A lot more difficult than I thought. Because I didn't want to write a book that was just going to bore people and just regurgitate what's in the newspaper. A lot of times nowadays with sports books, especially ones that they want to turn around fast. The internet's so easy. You just go in and steal stuff, so people go and buy it and they read it. It's the same stuff you find on the internet. So I wanted to do as many original chapters as I could. So it's 100 things Sounder fans should know and do before they die. It's 100 different chapters. And they each, there's a certain limit to the book, so they each would end up being approximately 800 word chapters, which is not a lot. I don't know if you guys have ever written, but it's a lot easier to write 2,000 words very quickly than it is to write 800 words very quickly and make it interesting and fit everything in there and not just spew on and on like you're writing a blog. So it's a little bit different. And so some of the chapters could be longer. I have some that are 1,300 words, some are a little shorter. But what it really is the important thing is to focus, like any book. And you don't have a lot of time. So my wife was actually going to London for business, and so I tagged along with her to England for a few days. And so she went to work during the day, and I'd just go hang out in cafes in London, and I was sitting there scribbling my list of 100 things that I was going to focus on, so that the minute I got back home, I could start filling out each chapter. And since I was with the team every day, I kind of plan out the chapters in advance and say, all right, there's certain people that are probably going to be in multiple chapters, so I'm going to focus on them first, talk to them, so that I don't have to scramble in the last month to do 50 chapters in the last month. I really had to, I knew it was like a ticking clock in my head. All right, I've got X amount of days left to get this done. I've got to average X amount of chapters, and I've got to make them interesting. And so it seems like an easier job than it is. That was a real challenge, turning around, because if you miss the deadline, they're never going to hit their publishing cycles, and they won't be able to get it out in the springtime, which they wanted to do. And so we pushed it right up to the limit. I was with them, but it was good, because I was with them at the MLS Cup game, the championship game last December in Toronto, and I watched the game, and I finished the book. I handed it in about a day or two late, but I handed it in right before the championship game. And then the championship game ended, and I said, well, this is silly. We have a book that's covering a year and almost 2 years minus the championship game in the second year. So I said, instead of doing a foreword to the book that's written by an ex-athlete or something like that, and I said, why don't we just use that space in the book to just tell them what happened in the championship game and do that. So I did it, and we were able to book in everything up until the last game, basically, that they had played in the 2017 season. So even though it was a speedy exercise, I think it really worked out. And the Sounders, the other thing, I mean, they've had one book written about them by Mike Gastineau, former KJR radio host, who's actually speaking tomorrow about book writing here. But he had done it a while ago, and he did it about their first season. Nobody had really written about what had happened since, and a lot's happened with this team in 10 years, so I really wanted to chronicle not just the modern Sounders and everything they've done, but the other iterations of the team, which existed throughout the 2000s and the 90s, and then the North American Soccer League team that existed in 1974 all the way through 1983. There are a lot of old-time soccer fans in Seattle that remember all these great things about this team, so I kind of wanted to expand the readership as much as possible, not just appealing to the millennials who go to games now or whatever, but the old-timers who went to those games back when I was a kid. And I love the North American Soccer League. I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and they had a team, a franchise there. I used to go see their games in Montreal. And so I knew, I'd always been a fan of soccer, just never written about it professionally. And so this book was great because I knew it was going to force me to focus on everything about the Sounders' history and know all this stuff that, even the people who've been watching the team for years didn't know. And it really was. It worked out. It was a perfect crash course. Only problem is I was renovating a house in Seattle at the time. It took almost 2 years to finish, and I was like homeless for a while. Living in like Airbnbs because contractors never get anything done on time. And so we finally told the contractors we're moving in, and we moved in the middle of a construction zone just when I had to finish this book. The last month that I was doing it, they were going hard at to get the house like livable, and I'm living in like one room, and I have this office that's kind of set up, and so I'm sitting there in the middle of the night, sometimes till 3, 4 in the morning, banging out chapters, because even though you do the best planning possible, you're never finished on time. And again, I wanted it to be good. I didn't want to write books that full of spelling mistakes that make no grammatical sense. And I wanted new stuff in there. So every night was just a blur. In fact, when I got the proofs back, so when you're writing this book, you send the stuff out, and then they send you back the proofs of what the book's actually going to look like. And I thought, this book is terrible. Like every writer, they think their work's pretty bad until they actually read it, and it's not that bad. I got the proofs back. I said, wow, this really looks like a real book. It's great. But then I noticed every single spelling mistake I had made. I had butchered some names of like longtime legends. There was one guy, I just couldn't get his name right, and there was like 50 mistakes. So I'm meticulously going through hundreds of pages, not with a computer, but because they're all physically there, and they want you to do it in pen. And so I'm trying to catch every single mistake. And I found almost every mistake in the book, except for one glaring one. Not many people know it, but Clint Dempsey, before he retired, if you know the Sounders, Clint Dempsey retired this year. So last year, right around August or September, he was 1 goal short of the all-time franchise record, which was held by Freddie Montero. So when I'm writing up the chapters on Dempsey, I assume that by the time I hand this book in, he's going to have like shattered that record. So I said, oh, back when Dempsey went on to break Montero's record, I put that in a few chapters. And I knew that in the back of my head, that I had done that. So when I get the proofs back, he didn't score, basically, Dempsey didn't score another goal the rest of his days. And then he retired this year. So he's 1 goal short of the all-time franchise record. So I caught them in I think it was like 4 or 5 chapters where I had made some allusion to it, and I forgot it right in the second, and it was the second chapter. And so I'm reading the proofs, and it takes me literally about 3 minutes to realize, not the proofs, when I got the final proofs back, and you can't do anything at that point. I'm looking at it, it's like, oh, geez, it's like right there. There's a mistake. I forgot to take it out. So it's right there, and interestingly, the next chapter, it mentions something completely different where I had changed it. So it's one of those things. But it was a fun experience. I thought, it was important to memorialize what the Sounders have done, and I tried to make it all encompassing. I guess this is a reading, so I'm supposed to read a little bit too. I'll read a bit. If it gets really boring, just let me know. But I picked a chapter out here. The favorite chapter I had in this was called, I believe it's the greatest Sounders game ever, I called it. And yeah, the greatest Sounders game ever, chapter 19. I actually discovered this chapter by accident because I was researching a bunch of other games on the internet, and sometimes, like, to get really into detail about stuff that happened long ago, you have to go into threads like Reddit and stuff just to see what people were saying at the time when it happened. And I remember I was looking up something totally different about the USL version of the Sounders, which was in the 1990s. And I was trying to find footage from some games to describe how the goals went. Because, I'd like to see, if I'm going to describe something in the book, I want to actually see it. And you don't have television archives of every single goal when you start going back 20 years. The internet, according to the internet, history didn't exist beyond like 2000 or something like that. So I was looking this up, and then all of a sudden, people were talking about this other replay that had nothing to do with anything I was looking up, and they're going, oh yeah, that was the greatest game ever. Nobody ever talks about that game. And so I'm saying, really, what's this? And I'm looking at it. It looked actually kind of interesting. Just this silent video, no words on it, and it's just going, and they're showing some goals being scored, and everybody's asking, where was that from? And they're saying, so I start, and it was from a playoff game in 1982 between the old Sounders and the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. It was the league semifinals. It was a best of 3, so the Sounders lost the first game at home, so the next game they have to go down to Fort Lauderdale, and if they lose, they're eliminated. If they win, then they can come and try to win Game 3 and go to the Soccer Bowl, it was called, which is like the Super Bowl for the North American Soccer League. It was called the Soccer Bowl. So I read about this game, and the more I'm looking it up, the more interesting it is, because there was just such a flurry of scoring, especially in the second half. There was an improbable tying goal by the Sounders right at the very end to just like break the hearts of everybody in that Fort Lauderdale stadium. And Roger Davies, who was like one of the all-time Sounders greats, set a scoring record in the North American Soccer League back in the day. He actually scored the tying goal, and he very nearly scored the winner in overtime. So they end up winning this game in sudden death. Long story short, they go on to win the series the very next game. They basically broke their backs when they won that game because the Strikers had their champagne ready to go. They thought they were going to win this game, and the Sounders came out of nowhere to win it. And it was just such an improbable game. It was played in like really, really sweltering temperatures down in Fort Lauderdale. And it was just, everybody left the field just mentally, physically exhausted afterwards, but it was this like incredible victory. And I'm looking back throughout Sounders history, and I'm saying, is this like the greatest game they've ever played? Now, I'm trying to look at other games they've played, and really for sheer entertainment value and for what was at stake, I couldn't find anything. I mean, the MLS Cup they won in Toronto a couple of years ago, but let's face it, that was a bit of a fluke. They basically got completely outplayed the entire game. They held on, didn't give up a goal, very nearly did until Fry saved them, and then they won on penalty kicks. It was a big deal. Yeah, the championship was big, but the game itself was not that. I wouldn't want to watch that game more than a couple of times unless I was a Sounders fan, diehard Sounders fan, because of the ending. But I think if I was a fan of any team, I would want to watch this game. So I wrote a chapter on this game, and that was my favorite because it was the toughest to find information on. And I figured, nobody's going to remember, a lot of people won't remember this game, but it's funny, some of the old timers did, and they couldn't believe I actually wrote about it, and that I found people that had played in the game. And you know, you go up to Sounders experts and go, I didn't really even know that this is what happened, and that this was, and so I wanted to give people a reason to buy the book, and that was one, to tell them something they didn't already know. Because if they can go Google it in 2 seconds, it's not much of a reason to buy the book. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Here, so I'll read for you. I'll try to dramatize it a little and make it. I'm also getting older, so my eyesight's not what it could be anymore. I should have brought my reading glasses. All right, so does this mic work, by the way? Are you hearing me back there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Things were looking desperate for the Sounders on a sweltering night in Fort Lauderdale. Their dream 1982 season in the North American Soccer League was on the verge of ending, down 3-2 to the hometown Strikers with less than a minute to play and the ball deep in their own end. At stake was a trip to that year's Soccer Bowl in San Diego. The Sounders had already been stunned 2-0 at the Kingdome in the opener of the best-of-3 series. Now, in a wild second game being televised nationally on USA Network, the Sounders had seen the lead change 3 times in the second half, and not in their favor. But the final act of what many consider the greatest game the Sounders had ever played was about to take place. Featuring heavily in it would be Roger Davies, the British midfielder and arguably the first true superstar the Sounders ever had. Davies had been urged over to the Sounders from England in 1980 by new head coach Alan Hinton, his former Derby County teammate who'd assisted on his very first career goal years earlier. And he responded by scoring a league record 25 times to earn NASL Most Valuable Player honors. Now, 2 years later, Davies' skills were diminishing at age 31. Davies had been reduced to coming off the bench late in games. His team had entered that muggy September 8th, 1982 night at Lockhart Stadium a confident bunch, although many Sounders fans had their doubts. The Strikers, led by top scorers Brian Kidd, Branko Segota, and Bert Holzenbein, had gone 18-14 overall, but were 12-4 at home in front of their rabid Striker-likers supporters. Lockhart was a small, cramped venue, and it felt as if the fans were literally on top of the players. On this night, even with the start time pushed back to 8 p.m. to accommodate the national TV broadcast, it was 88 degrees at kickoff, with the humidity making it feel like triple digits. As if that wasn't enough, the charged-up crowd of 15,196 was bringing even more heat, smelling blood after the Strikers' surprising win in Game 1. The Sounders had started the season just 3-9, but had gone 15-5 the rest of the way and been nearly unbeatable at home. Now, their armor had been pierced. Sounders defender Jeff Stock remembers heading into a hot and hostile environment where the Strikers had been talking things up for the hometown fans. And then Stock goes, quote, "They were talking smack," Stock said. "They were already talking about how they were going to be in the final." And that, more than anything, he said, ticked off the Sounders. Despite the heat, the crowd, and the series deficit, they just collectively thought there was no way we were ever going to lose this game. That's Stock talking again. It's hard to read this out loud because it's made for print, but I'm trying my best. I also don't get to read all that much, so I might have to go over some sentences twice. They're small chapters too, so you won't be here much longer. The teams played a tense, scoreless first half in which Strikers' leading scorer, Kidd, was injured in the 17th minute and replaced up top by Yugoslavian-born, Canadian-raised Segota. It would be the 21-year-old Segota who finally opened the scoring in the 54th minute, sending the stadium into a frenzy. But that was only the beginning of a wild 35 minutes to come. Hinton waited until the 65th minute to substitute Davies in, along with Victoria-born center back Ian Bridge, to generate some late-game offense. And that's exactly what happened. The Sounders stunned the crowd by scoring twice in fewer than 4 minutes to take the lead, with Peter Ward and Davies striking in the 69th and 73rd minutes. But with just more than 10 minutes to play, Holzenbein tied it 2-2, and then teamed up with Segota to feed Ray Hudson for the go-ahead goal just 86 seconds later. Once again, the stadium was in a frenzy. The hometown Strikers had to kill off 8 more minutes, and they'd be off to the second soccer bowl in team history. They were getting champagne bottles ready in the locker room with 5 minutes to go, Stock said. But we were like, "Are you kidding me? How are we even behind in this game? We never gave up. And as the clock ticked down to 1 minute remaining, the crowd rose to its feet, urging the home team on. The ball was played back to Sounders keeper Paul Hammond. Center back Bridge was by now all the way up the field, as he'd been for most of the final minutes. When you're playing your center back that far up, things must be pretty desperate, Stock said, but we never doubted we could do it. What happened next has gone down in Sounders lore. I just felt like something was going to happen, Sounders coach Hinton said. It was only a feeling, but we never quit. Hammond booted the ball much of the length of the field, and it somehow went straight to Bridge, who flicked it to Ward along the left flank. What would have happened if their defender would have headed it, Hinton said. We would have lost the game. Instead, Ward now moved the ball up to the edge of the box and then flung what Hinton called a beautiful cross, quote unquote, to an onward sprinting Davies, who arrived just as the ball got there. Davies unleashed a snap header past helpless goalkeeper Jan van Beveren to the near post. The Sounders screamed with delight, an ecstatic Davies pumping his left arm in triumph in what would ultimately be his final goal ever scored for the team. The stunned strikers collapsed to their knees, knowing a championship berth had just been snatched away. Van Beveren sat in his crease, head between his hands. Only 43 seconds remained on the clock. It was unbelievable, Hinton said. I've described it as some things that are not going to happen just did. Stock remembers barely being able to move as he raced over to Davies to celebrate the goal. I must have lost 8 pounds that night, Stock said. We left our guts out on the field the final 10 minutes. But as depleted as the Sounders felt, the strikers were crushed. In the stands, the striker-likers were deathly silent. That's what they call their diehard fans, the striker-likers. It sounds like groupies, but anyway. The striker-likers were deathly silent, so much so that the Sounders' whooping and hollering could be heard above the din. But the game wasn't over yet. The Sounders, given new life, carried that momentum into sudden death overtime, and just 4 minutes in, Ward put another cross over from the left side that Davies again struck with a header. The ball might have found its way in the net on its own, but just in case, Kenny Hibbett was there at the goal mouth to head it home for one of the easiest scores of his career. The Sounders erupted in celebration, storming the field after their 4-3 victory. The shocked home fans trudged slowly to the exit, barely comprehending the turn of events. Everybody went nuts, Hinton said. I said to Peter Ward after the game, quote, I've never thought you were a great crosser of the ball, but today you proved you were one of the greatest crossers of all time. Hinton was joking a little there, but the emotion of the night had taken a toll on both sides, with the exhaustion evident in their faces. It would carry over to 2 days later when they played a far less intense Game 3 in front of more than 28,000 fans at the Kingdom. Scoreless after regulation, Hibbett would add another sudden death goal, this one from distance, to propel the Sounders to their second soccer bowl. And although the Sounders would lose the soccer bowl to the New York Cosmos, the excitement of their playoff run, especially the thrilling Game 2 semifinal, would remain etched in the minds of fans for decades to come. And when naming the game that stood out above the rest, those familiar with Pacific Northwest soccer will often point to that night when Davies came off the bench for one last hurrah. Davies was traded that offseason to, of all teams, the Strikers. He'd play out 1983 in Fort Lauderdale and then head back to England for several lower-tier seasons before retiring in 1987. But the contributions by Davies, Hibbett, Ward, and others that hot night in Florida have never been forgotten by those who witnessed it. Decades later, Stock remembers it as if it were yesterday. Quote, it was just great players doing great things, unquote. Now, anyway, I like that chapter just because, again, if you Google it online, you're not going to find anything. It's very difficult to find anything about what happened in the North American Soccer League back in the 80s or the 70s. And, it took a lot of research. I actually had some help from a guy named Frank McDonald, who's a longtime soccer historian here locally. I actually called him up and I said, Frank, do you have any game sheets? And I know he keeps every game sheet from every Sounders game ever played. Do you have the game sheets with the summaries from those games so I can try to piece together what happened? And he gave it to me. But he admitted he had hardly any info at all about the game. So I had to find out stuff, talk to a bunch of people who aren't quoted in here, go and do that. I mean, I put a lot of work into that chapter, and I tried to sum it up and describe it. Again, we don't have 3,000 words to go on and on into every bit of detail, so I try to cram the relevant stuff in there and make it readable and easy for people to figure out. And so that's what the book was about. I mean, there's other stuff. There's business stuff in there. There's profiles on certain people, like Brian Schmetzer, Garth Lagerwey, Ziggy Schmidt, a bunch of players too. There's a lot of stuff, some stuff in here from Clint Dempsey that he's never shared with anybody. It's just was able to put in a lot of good stuff. Told a very good story about Gustav Svensson, and he was playing in Crimea for a while back when the Soviets, when the Russians invaded the Crimea a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, and him and his family, they had to escape from there on a van with some of the other players, and they had to go through checkpoints like with paramilitary people boarding with machine guns to look for their papers and stuff. It was pretty nerve-wracking, nerve-wracking time. And I put some of that in there. I tried to balance things out through the eras, through good mix of game coverage and feature stories. So that's what I was trying to do with that. You guys are very patient listening to me read an entire chapter. I used to be the best reader in my school back in like 3rd grade or something, but that was a long time ago. It was back in the 1970s when reading out loud was a lot more common than it is today. So I appreciate you sticking with this. Does anybody have any questions at all? You can ask me about the current team. You can ask me about hockey in Seattle if you want. You can ask me about the book. You're sitting there, so you can do whatever you want.
Just as a writer for a newspaper, just what challenges did you find writing a book, and just how different was it in terms of the writing process and the product version?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's very different. I'm fortunate because in my current job I do a lot of longer form writing, and that was a blessing and not so much, just because a lot of these chapters were shorter than some of the things I do for the paper now. So the research element to it I was very familiar with. It wasn't like writing game stories. I mean, I kind of know what goes into features from a color perspective, the little anecdotes to look for, the little hidden things that make something a little more than a newspaper story. The problem is the space limitations on some of the chapters made it impossible to really get into that. So the one thing I've learned at the Times, as our newspaper shrinks smaller and smaller, we've really gone from writing, in the past, we would have written a 3,000 word feature on stuff. Now we try to keep everything 2,000 words or fewer. And so I've written stories that really, back in the 90s, let's say, they would have come in at 4,000 words easily. I've had to learn how to condense that to 2,000 words in the paper and still make it, read really well. And some of those stories have won national awards. So I know that there is room for that kind of stuff. You can still write really good stuff even at that length. And so that helped prepare me for the book, even when writing a 1,000-word or an 800-word chapter, just because nowadays in my job, I spend more time cutting and editing than I do actually researching the story and writing it the first time, if that makes sense. So I'm very good at going through my own thing, and somebody tells me, you got to cut 300 words from this in an hour, I can do it. It's not that hard. Not that difficult. I've learned how to do it so much from doing it with the newspaper that it really helped with this, because there were times I just didn't have time to sit there for days on end editing chapters. I kind of had to know what to do at the beginning and then go through it and bang, cut stuff, leave it on the floor. Editing is so important to writing. If you've ever seen a bad Hollywood movie, it's to the point now where I can tell which movies were directed by famous actors who have people that are afraid to tell them what to do, because the best editors out there just know how to take the extraneous stuff out. And there's some movies I go to where it's like 3 hours long or 2.5, and I said, this movie should not have been more than 1 hour and 40 minutes long. And you just know, because the story doesn't flow. It's the same thing with writing. And also, you know which movies have bad scripts. Because the best stuff on TV now always is on cable TV, on HBO. It's like the golden age of television now. That's why you get the best actors still in there. But they have the best writing as well. And the dialogue just flows along, and the story itself flows along. If you have a lousy script, poorly written script, it doesn't matter how good the acting is or the special effects, your TV series or your movie's just not going to make it. And so that's just very important. So that prepared me. The work I've done in the last, let's say, 5 years at the Seattle Times did prepare me for that part of writing a book. That was easy to read. I mean, they didn't do very much editing at all in here. It came in right around the length. They wanted, I think it was 180,000 words. I think I gave them about 182,000, which is easy for those guys. They're used to getting 250,000 and then having to spend 2 months knocking it down. So it was great. We hit our targets. We got everything ready. We got the book out on time. So it was fun. It was fun.
What was the response from the organization? like the Sounders?
Oh,
What was their
I'll
response?
tell you what, Sounders are great because they want all the publicity they can get. Yeah, you know, and they're not overly sensitive when it comes. I mean, I tried to write a book. It wasn't all just PR. I put some negative stuff in there too, and I told you know, and I think they understand that to make something real, like you gotta have the good and the bad. Like there was some stuff in there that wasn't that good about him. Like I wrote about the Freddie Montero rape accusations, which I'm sure they wouldn't have wanted to see in there. But I mean, their PR guy's pretty smart, and you know, we have some conversations afterwards, and he goes, "No, I love that you put that in there because you know that's a book I'll go and read." And it's true. Like, you don't just want to read a team-approved thing, but their reaction was great because they love getting the publicity. They think, you know, we should have people writing books about it. Yeah, and we won a championship. We've had a great time. So they've been really receptive to it, and they've done a good job helping me promote it. And it's one thing I've learned is when you write a book, the promotion part of it never ends. And I've got a friend, his name's Jeff Perlman. He used to write for Sports Illustrated. Now he makes his living writing books. He's written about Barry Bonds, Brett Favre. He's got a book out right now about the United States Football League, and specifically about Donald Trump's participation in the United States Football League back in the 80s when he was one of the more controversial owners and basically helped seal the league's demise. So it's a really interesting book, but Jeff will admit it, he's not shy. He'll go out and stand on street corners hawking his book. I mean, you really do have to sell because it's such a tough environment now with the internet out there and all this free content that book publishers won't take the chances they used to take unless they know they can make a profit. And so if you're ever going to make any money, you have to prove yourself that you can sell the book to a point, or else you'll never make money on your first book, but you want to try to make it on your second, your third, your fourth. And so if you want to get a second chance, third chance, they do have to have some kind of a return on their investment. This book, they didn't pay me $1 million for it or anything. I mean, they paid me enough, and that's it. I mean, they'll sell it, they'll make a modest profit on it, but that's good. What they don't want is to take a bath on the product. So, you know, it's really a business. Yeah, and I understood that to a point, but I didn't realize like how much of a business, how meticulous they are down to how many books they give away for free to people, to you know, how to price it, how to do pre-sales online, and that. Like they're really focused on not losing money, obviously, or else they'll go out of business eventually. I don't know. So that's something I learned.
What would you like your next book to be?
Something more serious. No, I'm serious. You know, even the title here. I mean, I say this sometimes, and we kind of laugh privately about it, just because. I mean, it is a very formulaic book title. I tried to do the best I could with it. I would like to do something a lot more serious. Something could be sports related. I mean, in the back of my head, I'm going to do a fiction novel one day. I covered a lot of baseball around the world. I've written about the Dominican steroids epidemic amongst teenagers and stuff down in the Dominican Republic. I've spoken in Venezuela about Latin American exploitation, and I don't think there's necessarily a nonfiction book there, but I think it'd make a great setting for a fiction novel at some point involving, you know, maybe kidnapping, extortion, something like that. Just because it's a real dark side of baseball nobody understands. Again. Back in 2005, when I was down there researching a series I did for the Toronto Star newspaper in the Dominican Republic, there was a ball player named Raul Mondesi he was playing for the Pirates at the time, but I had met him in Toronto when he was playing there, and he played for the Dodgers primarily in his career. He ended up quitting in the middle of the season and leaving, and nobody knew why. It turns out he went down to the Dominican because one of these freelance talent scouts, they basically grab kids off the street there and train them in baseball. These guys with no like coaching certificates or anything will train these kids and then sell them to major league teams for the highest bidder. So this guy grabbed Mondesi off the street when he was 15, made him agree verbally that if he ever made the major leagues, he would give him 3% of his contract. And so he ended up selling Mondesi to a major league team for whatever cut he got. But then years later, Mondesi got a $100 million contract. So this guy shows up in court in the Dominican saying, well, Mondesi owes me $3 million because he promised me verbally when he was 15 that he was going to give me a 3% cut of any contract he made. So he wanted his $3 million, and some court agreed and basically froze all of Mondesi's assets down in the Dominican. It's a Dominican court down in the Dominican Republic. So Mondesi leaves the Pittsburgh Pirates mid-season. Everybody's like, what the hell's going on? And nobody wants to say. it turns out he went down there and he had to go, and they found out later because he's showing up in court having to fight these accusations. He had to take it all the way to the Supreme Court because this Buscone, they call it, this freelance talent scout, wouldn't cooperate with it. I've had drinks with Mondesi in the past at a hotel bar. The night before he got traded to the Yankees by the Blue Jays, he was asking me if they were going to trade him to the Yankees, and I told him yes. I didn't know it was going to happen the next day, but they did. They were trying to shop him because he had such a big contract. So anyway, I'd love to go actually do a story on him someday. He's in prison now, I believe. He ended up becoming mayor of San Cristobal down in the Dominican, and then he was stealing cable TV from he was like diverting cable lines and giving people free cable and taking a cut of the money. And so anyway, he ended up going to jail down there for fraud, breach of trust, all kinds of stuff. Interesting guy, very, very interesting guy. But I did, when I was down there, track down the freelance talent scout who actually sued him for that money. He was a former Major League Baseball player himself, not a big-time guy, but his name was Mario Guerrero. And his brother was Epi Guerrero, who was a famous scout down in the Dominican, one of the most famous of all time. Basically ended up becoming an alcoholic and dropped off the map. But Mario was his younger brother. And his other brother, Patrick, used to be one of the Mariners' top Latin American scouts for years, and then went over to the Dodgers. So I tracked down Mario Guerrero, and he was in the middle of the city park training a bunch of kids, training about 12 kids at the same time, hoping that one of them will actually get sold to a major league team. That's how they do it down there. It's a real system of exploitation. And so I found this guy, and he said, yeah, he wasn't apologetic. At the time, they hadn't gone to the Supreme Court of the Dominican yet. And he told me, yeah, he wants to show me he has power. Well, I have power too. It's going to be power against power, he told me. It was great. It was a fun, we put that in one of our stories. But I mean, this stuff goes on all the time. Major League Baseball still hasn't completely come to grips with it. And that's why you see a lot of players from the Dominican Republic getting popped for steroids, left like Robinson Cano. When you're in the Dominican and you're 15, by the time you're like 16 years old, 17, if you're not hitting or pitching as hard or hitting the ball as far or pitching as hard as a 21-year-old, you're never going to sign with any major league team. They want to see adults who are teenagers. It's a bad system, but that's the way it is. If you're 19 in the Dominican and you haven't been signed by anybody, you're done. So they take drugs. They basically, these scouts give these kids drugs. Sometimes they give them farm animal veterinary stuff, and they pump them up, and they send them to. They hope that they get sold off for a couple $100,000 or whatever. And they make it all the way to the majors, still taking drugs, and then they end up failing drug tests left, right, and center. And I think the number is like 65, 70% are from Venezuela and the Dominican Republic. And it's not a coincidence, it's because that's the system they came out of. And Major League Baseball's been trying to clamp down on it for years, and they've had moderate success. Now there's actually a federal investigation going on about the Major League Baseball's practices down in Latin America. And it could be a real bombshell. It's just started happening the last couple of weeks. It's come out that there's been this ongoing investigation, and I'm trying to remember which branch of the government. It's not the FDA. But it's a criminal investigation, and they've already subpoenaed several teams to come and testify. And I'm sure the Mariners will be one of them because they've had a lot of dealings down there, and some of their people who've since left the organization were not always above board. So there's this whole underbelly no one's heard of. So that's something I'd like to write about, but from a fiction perspective. Just because a player leaves mid-season to go down, I mean, you can create all kinds of scenarios where maybe he's being threatened, maybe his family member's been kidnapped, maybe So I think that would be a good fiction novel to work on. So that's a long-winded answer.
Sounds like a good book.
I think it would be. Yeah. Now I just have to find the time to do it. Everybody talks about books. Do you have a question you would like?
No, I don't.
No. Okay. I'm going to quiz you. So when I asked you about the second goal at the strike, no, I'm just kidding. So that's it. I don't know. Am I early?
Yeah.
I guess so. Anything else you'd like to talk about? Anybody hockey fans here?
Gonna become one.
Yeah.
You'll have no choice. Yeah, we're gonna have a hockey team on December 3rd or 4th.
Yep.
I just booked the trip yesterday down to Sea Island, Georgia. Has anybody ever been to Sea Island, Georgia?
No.
So it's this really rich place. They only have 2 hotels in the whole thing, both gated, both basically golf course, gated resorts for billionaires to go to. And that's where they're having the National Hockey League Board of Governors meetings, because most of the owners of the NHL are now billionaires. And so they don't like to go stay at the Holiday Inn Express. So Major League Baseball is a little better. They usually have their things at like the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in, or now it's a Marriott in Nashville or something like that. Not these guys. They pick like the furthest away spots in Palm Beach or whatever, like the $700 a night starting rates for hotels. And so that's where we're going. So I will be staying at the Brunswick Courtyard by Marriott. And Brunswick's about a 45-minute drive from Seattle in Georgia. And then just getting up early and driving there every morning. So can't ask the newspaper to pay that kind of money. Much as I'd love to, you know, go and buy the $14 coffee, it's not gonna fly with our guys. So that's it. So you guys get a break. You get let out of school early today.
Yeah.
Thank you for being so polite and listening.
Thank
to
you.
me.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Uh,
Thank